Hey everyone. So in this video, I'm going to be going over the kind of what's similar and what's different from Unit 2 supply and demand versus the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. With supply and demand, it was pretty simple. You always started in equilibrium. You either shifted your supply curve or your demand curve to the right or to the left, and then you found a new equilibrium. With aggregate demand, aggregate supply, some of it is similar. There's going to be a few key differences though. The first thing is that when we shift, it's still increase to the right, decrease to the left. So that's the same. So if aggregate demand increases, then we draw our arrow to the right and we move it to the right. If aggregate supply decreases, we draw our arrow to the left and we move to the left. So that's nice. We're still shifting right and left, increase to the right, decrease to the left. One of the differences, however, is that we don't always start off in an equilibrium with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Now, if you get a question that asks you about something in the short run, if you wanted to, you could draw our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. You could do it just like this. All right. And in fact, it looks just like Unit 2 in the short run. That if we're only looking at kind of like a short run change, right? For instance, if you had a multiple choice question on the AP test that said, what would be the short run effect of an increase in wages in the economy, right? Okay, short run effect, then I'm really only going to look at this. And wages, that's the price of a resource, labor. So an increase in wages would be an increase in the price of a resource. So aggregate supply is going to decrease to the left. So I draw my new aggregate supply curve. And it looks just like Unit 2. Price level is going up, GDP is going down. In the short run, it's exactly the same, right? We just have our aggregate demand, aggregate supply to the sky, aggregate demand to the dirt. It's basically the same. Where it becomes different is that in macroeconomics with our aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, we have a basis of comparison that we never had in micro with supply and demand. That with supply and demand, if we're looking at like the market for coffee, there is no like ideal amount or quantity of coffee to have produced in society. It depends on the wants of society, right? And that the demands of the people, you know, mixed together with the costs of production and supply, come up with whatever the current amount of coffee is. And if those things change, they change. But in macroeconomics, right, remember that what we see over time is our economy tends to cycle back and forth between these like periods of extreme production, which drives up inflation. The bubble bursts and then it comes crashing back into a recession, and then it goes back up into one of those recoveries, and then it crashes back down into a recession. So in macroeconomics, we have a basis of comparison. It's that idea of full employment. So that our model in macro, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, it might not always start off in equilibrium. So one of the things that you need to be able to do is that if the question tells you the economy is currently in a recession, right? Or another phrase you might hear is the economy is currently operating below full employment. You need to know that you can, right? One of the skills that you have to have is to be able to draw this. That you need to be able to put your long-run aggregate supply curve to the right of your intersection point, because your current intersection is below full employment, so that in the end, it would look like this. Okay. And there you go. Now, you might notice on the on the x-axis, that there's like an abbreviation for GDP, which is kind of crazy. It's an abbreviation for an acronym. But in economics, we're nothing if not focused on efficiency. So why write 3 letters when you can write 1? So the letter that we've chosen, the letter that we use as a shorthand for GDP is Y, right? So you can see here that at the long run aggregate supply curve, we have our YFE. I know I didn't draw that very clearly. Let me redraw it so maybe with capital letters so it's a little more clear, right? YFE, that stands for full employment, and then I've got YC that stands for current. So that what we could see is in this economy, the current intersection point is to the left of full employment. So that tells us that we are underproducing. We have a recessionary gap, right? Or you might start off with a full employment, or you might start off with an inflationary gap. So again, in some ways it's similar, but in some ways it's different. And the key way that it's different that you need to know is that if we're comparing to a long run full employment, we might start with an inflationary gap. We might start with a recessionary gap. We might start at full employment. You need to know how to start with all three. Compared to Unit 2, it was simple. It was always equilibrium, change, equilibrium. In macro, it's not always that case. So, all right. Hope that was helpful. See you guys in the next video.